Great, we're now live on Facebook too, so I think we're ready to get started.
Great. Well, welcome to the League of Women Voters Day of Action on People-Powered Fair Maps. This is a national event, and leagues across the country are hosting events on redistricting today. I am Laura Ladd Bierman, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of New York State. The League is a nonpartisan membership organization with 47 local leagues across New York State and over 3,700 members. We strive to educate the public and advocate on key issues in our communities, the state, and the country. Tonight, we're talking about redistricting in the League's first ever People's Hearing. Redistricting impacts all aspects of policy since it determines voters' power to elect candidates that best represent their community's interests. This is a League-sponsored hearing, and we appreciate all who are participating. We want to especially thank our co-sponsors, APA Voice and Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. To start the program, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Weiss, Adjunct Professor of Law and Senior Fellow with the Census and Redistricting Institute at New York Law School, for a brief overview of what redistricting is and how it works in New York State. Jeff?
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and good evening, everybody across New York State. It's a pleasure to be with you. This has certainly been a busy week in the world of reapportionment and redistricting since New York learned that we're going to lose one congressional district. And I'll just start off with some food for thought that we all know and are hurting over the loss of one district by 89 people. But we also have to look at the interesting numbers that New York State's population in the last decade grew by 4%, by 830,000 people since 2010. That doubles the rate of growth from 2000 to 2010, where the state only grew by 4%, or by about 400,000 people. And we won't see the final localized data until August or September. But as we lost one congressional district by a straight run of the numbers by 89 people, we have to wait and see in August whether New York State's numbers were so high that we might have actually been overcounted, and that helped us save the loss of a second congressional district. We don't know that yet. We always assume from census taking that there is a great differential undercount, especially in the hard to count communities. So the numbers were a bit perplexing, and it certainly gave us a lot to think about between now and when the data comes out. But I'll take a few minutes and just give you an overview of the new redistricting process that New York State will undertake this year. I think, as many know, a constitutional amendment adopted by the voters in 2014 created a new independent redistricting commission tasked with recommending congressional and state legislative district lines to the legislature. That commission of 10 members is now has been convened. It's been meeting. Just earlier this month, it received $4 million in funding, and the commission will begin moving forward with outreach plans, with hearings, with all sorts of activities, starting its next meeting on May 6th. The commission is tasked with reporting a draft plan to the public for Congress and the legislature by September 15th, being mindful that because of the Census Bureau delays caused by the pandemic, and the Trump administration's efforts to change things around at the Census Bureau, the PL 94-171, or the block by block data that includes information by race, age, and ethnicity, will first arrive on or about August 16th in raw form, and then in final data will arrive by September 30th. But we're told that the raw data to arrive in mid-August will be uncrunchable, so to speak, by experts to make that data available both to the commission and to the public through various public mapping websites that you'll have access to. So a lot of things are going to happen very quickly. Unlike the 9-month period that the state constitutional amendment passed in 2014 envisioned, the commission will only have about 3 or 4 months to enact a plan, not the 9 months that it had originally planned to take. Also in November of this year, you, the voters of New York, will be asked to approve or reject another constitutional amendment that will change some of the deadlines as well as the voting requirements that the commission and the legislature would need to enact a plan, as well as a few other things, including the size of the state Senate, prison gerrymandering, and other items that you'll all learn about, which I don't have the time right now to fully discuss. So the commission, there are 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 2 independents. There are 10 members altogether. There is no tie-breaking 11th member, which makes the task a bit challenging to reach consensus, since under current law, you need to have 7 of the 10 members vote to approve a plan, and it requires that minority party, meaning Republican Party, members of the commission support the plan. So as New York loses 1 congressional district and has to reconfigure the shapes of the Senate, Assembly, and congressional districts, there's a lot ahead. The commission, as I mentioned, is supposed to have a draft map out for the public to review by September 15th. The commission is also tasked with a deadline of having its first plan submitted to the legislature for approval by January 1st. And under current law, the legislature has a period of time to accept or reject the plan. Governor, of course, has to sign it or veto it. If the first plan is rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor, the commission has until February 28th to submit a second plan. And if that plan fails, then the legislature can draw a plan of its own. However, as we know, the New York primary has been moved from September to June, making it important that the deadline be moved up to a more realistic deadline, not a second plan in February, but we're nowhere near that point yet. And the amendment, if it passes in November, I won't get into the merits of it, will change the schedule. My sense is that the final plan needs to be enacted both for Congress and the legislature by the end of January next year. That's not set in stone yet. It's not in the law, but it generally takes 2 or 3 weeks minimum for the county boards of elections to make sense of the maps, to change the current election districts into the new assembly districts required by law to conduct an election, because as we know, the spring primary petitioning for 2022 begins generally in late February or early March. So I hope I provided a very quick, succinct overview of the process. It's new, it's different. The commission has a lot of work ahead of it, and we'll be learning more about that over the days and weeks ahead. And I'm very pleased to join with the New York State League in providing education and training programs. Please feel free anytime to contact me at New York Law School, very easily Googleable. So thank you very much, and I look forward to watching my friends and colleagues and people I don't know make presentations for the next hour and a half.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm actually going to put the link to the panelist list in the chat right now. So anyone who wants to follow along as we go through our 20 panelists can use that link to do so. Our first testifier tonight will be Fulvia Vargas de Leon, Associate Counsel to Latino Justice PRLDA.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Fulvia Vargas de Leon. I'm an Associate Counsel with Latino Justice PRLDA. Latino Justice PRLDA would like to express its profound appreciation to the New York League of Women Voters for organizing this event and inviting us to testify. LJ's redistricting work spans over 4 decades of ensuring districts are drawn in a manner which fairly and accurately reflect community population demographics. Redistricting is a complex process, but is an essential component to our democracy, to enabling our communities and having a voice in voting for candidates of their choosing to represent them. If redistricting is done fairly and transparently, we are then more likely to have a government that is truly representative of the people it serves. If redistricting is intertwined in partisan political shenanigans to facilitate incumbent gerrymandering, we're then more likely to end up with districts that provide our community with less electoral power than others. Latino Justice Pro Def, originally established as the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund in 1972, is one of the country's leading nonprofit civil rights public interest law organizations. We work to advance, promote, and protect the legal rights of Latinos throughout the nation. As part of our ongoing work to protect the right of Latino voters, we have advocated and litigated against practices that seek to dilute the vote of minority communities, such as voter roll purges, failure to provide language assistance at poll sites, and redistricting practices that seek to dilute the voting power of communities of color. The redistricting fight is well underway, and as Jeff mentioned this week, we learned that New York will lose one congressional seat. We know that this will begin a discussion about where the loss should occur. Do we push the loss on the congressional representatives of the greater New York City metropolitan area, including Long Island, or those of upstate or Western New York, where there has been diminishing overall population numbers? Do we consider whether it would be fair for the loss of a district to occur upstate, where there's greater population loss, in order to prevent the disenfranchisement of downstate district voters? Redistricting is complicated, but it does not excuse practices that tactically cancel out the collective voting strength of certain communities. During the last redistricting cycle after the 2010 census, Latino Justice fought tirelessly to ensure that New York's congressional and Senate districts were a true reflection of our communities. This meant going into federal court to initially address LATPOR's failure to timely draw congressional district plans in time for 2012 primaries and a subsequent equal protection challenge to New York State's Senate plans, which created an overpopulated districts downstate and underpopulated districts upstate, and the creation of the 63rd Senate seat in the Capital District area as a means to try and preserve a partisan political stronghold in our state's government. When elected officials and legislative bodies are given exclusive, unfettered power to manipulate district lines, voters lose. While we are entering a new redistricting cycle with the newly created New York State Independent Redistricting Commission in place for the first time, we are well aware of the partisan manipulation to draw maps with favorite parties over the people. This is also the first redistricting cycle without the pre-clearance protections contained in the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act checks and balances on any electoral changes in the covered jurisdictions like Bronx, Kings, and New York counties. In New York, Latinos represent nearly 20% of the state's population. With redistricting efforts occurring every 10 years, it is imperative that any reapportionment process include the voices and demographics of Latino communities. Latino Justice Pro Def wants to ensure that this redistricting process is equitable in a way that districts are drawn and that transparent decisions are made reflecting communities of color. Latino Justice Pro Def stands by a redistricting process that is, 1, open the public's ability to actively engage at every step of the process, 2, draws maps in a manner which accurately reflects changes in the population, and 3, focuses on safeguarding racial minority groups from maps which have the effect of diminishing their ability to elect candidates of their choice. We must take affirmative steps to ensure that this redistricting cycle does not run counter to the protections offered by the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act, as well as the essence of democracy guaranteed by the principle of one person, one vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Fulvia. Next, we'll have Liz Uyang, Coordinator for APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. Liz?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
APA Voice stands for Asian Pacific American Voting and Organizing to Increase Civic Engagement. Its redistricting task force is a coalition of 15 leading APA civic engagement groups throughout the city. The range of our members include longtime community-based social service organizations with offices in multiple boroughs, a health clinic in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, to an all-volunteer women's advocacy group in Richmond Hill, Queens. Educating our communities on the importance of civic engagement and exercising our right to vote unites us. Collectively, we provide culturally sensitive critical services, legal assistance, housing advocacy, immigration advice and representation, senior citizen and youth programs, ESL classes, job training, and more. The APA population has grown over the past 10 years, According to the 2019 American Community Survey, it predicts the Asian American community will constitute 14.9% of the city, up from 11.8% in 2010. This represents an additional 51,000 plus Asian Americans to the city's population for an estimated total of 1,186,608 Asian Pacific Americans. 75% of this growth is in Brooklyn and Queens alone. Our growing numbers demand that our voices be heard. We are involved in redistricting to ensure the 2020 redistricting cycle is accessible and fair, the Voting Rights Act is complied with, and our communities of interest are kept intact where possible. The shocking increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in New York City is alarming. Since 2019, the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased over 2,700%. In the first 3 months of 2020 alone, the number of suspected hate crimes against Asian Americans tripled the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans in 2019. We must be able to elect candidates who will protect our communities and enact effective policies that will ensure peaceful integration. In a city that represents the most diverse immigrants in the country, we need to elect representatives who appreciate the benefits of multiculturalism. Tonight, you will hear the voices of 6 of APA Voice Redistricting Task Force organizational members that serve thousands across the city. In order to maximize our participation in democracy, our communities need to be able to elect the candidates of our choice, if the law requires it, and our communities' interests must be kept intact. On a local level, our communities need to be kept together so we can better advocate for closer COVID vaccination sites, more affordable housing, improved police-community relations, recreation centers, and decongested traffic. On a national level, at a time when New York State is losing 1 congressional seat, coupled with the attacks on our nation's capital on January 6th, we need to be able to elect fearless representatives who will fight for affordable health care, equitable policy, fair immigration policies, and protect our voting rights. We look forward to a 2020 redistricting cycle that is inclusive and fair, that will enable our communities to elect candidates who will protect them and be held accountable. Thanks to the League of Women Voters for allowing us to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Next, we'll hear from Howard Wong, Civic Engagement Manager for the Chinese American Planning Council.
Hi. The mission of Chinese American Planning Council is to promote social and economic empowerment of Chinese Americans, immigrants, and low-income communities. CPC was founded in 1965 as a grassroots community-based organization in response to the end of Chinese Exclusion Act and the passing of the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. Our services have expanded since our founding, including 3 key program areas, including education, family support, and community and economic empowerment. CPC is a member of an organization of APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. CPC is the largest Asian American social service organization in the US, providing vital resources to more than 60,000 people per year through more than 50 programs at over 30 cities across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. CPC employs over 700 staff whose comprehensive services are linguistically accessible, culturally sensitive, and highly effective in reaching low-income and immigrant individuals and families. With the firm belief that social services can incite social change, CPC strives to empower our constituent as an agent of social justice with overarching goals of advancing and transforming our communities. CPC provides childhood education, infant and toddler services, senior services, career services, nutrition services, and more, all funded in significant part by resources directed and tied to the decennial census and its data. The COVID-19 pandemic have reinforced and emphasized the fact that our marginalized community are in need of resources. In New York City, 1 in 4 Asians live in poverty even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. This crisis has only worsened as a result of the pandemic. Unemployment within the AAPI New Yorker community increased over 6,900%, which has made affordable necessity like food, rent, and utilities challenging. Around 160,000 Asian Americans in New York do not have access to health insurance. These statistics alone do not scratch the surface of experiences of AAPI community members. In order to address these issues our community are facing, we must have a fair and independent redistricting process. An unfair redistricting process will divide our deeply, rapidly growing communities, minimize our concern, and deprive them of effective representations for years to come. The greater New York metropolis is home to the largest ethnic Chinese population outside of Asia and is the largest metropolitan Asian American group in the nation. It is also home to the largest Asian national diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, with Flushing, Queens being one of the largest, fastest growing AAPI communities in the world. Despite this explosion of growth, there are only a handful of AAPI elected officials in the New York City, state, and federal representation. And only in 2017 was an Asian Pacific American task force transformed at the state level to represent community interests. Asians are the fastest growing racial group. There is a need to be serious consideration to be given to ensure that those numbers and the community in which they share multiple interests are respected and kept whole, and that Asian Americans have the political influence that they are entitled to. Our community should be able to have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect the candidate of their choice. In order to ensure that fair lines are drawn, the Independent Redistricting Commission should prevent partisan and racial gerrymandering, aim to keep ethnic, racial, and language minority community groups intact, identify communities of interest and other crucial information, seek public opinion and input during the mapping and redrawing districting process. Any member of the public should be able to submit maps and provide or comment for consideration by the commission. CPC appreciate the opportunity to testify on this issue that greatly impacts our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Next, we'll hear from Jerry Guatemala, Director for Democracy Programs for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Hey, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of New York for this opportunity to participate in this really wonderful event. I am the Director of the Democracy Program at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF. We were founded in 1974 in New York City, and our mission is to protect the civil rights of Asian Americans, and we do that through litigation, education, community education, organizing. We are a member of the APA Voice Redistricting Task Force, and we are a member of the Unity Map Coalition, along with Latino Justice, Pearl Deaf, and the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. ALDEF has been involved in redistricting for at least the last 3 redistricting cycles. We are calling on the Independent Redistricting Commission to follow the requirements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are special protections for communities of color, including Asian Americans, because of historical racial discrimination in voting against these communities. Asian American communities of interest are geographically compact and defined and must be kept whole at all legislative levels. Asian American communities of interest have traditionally not been able to elect candidates of its choice like other communities. We are asking for equal treatment, not special treatment. We seek to be put on equal footing as other communities so that Asian Americans can elect candidates of their choice. The Asian American growth rate has been far outpacing the growth of New York City's boroughs overall, and we expect similar results for this census. The new districts should reflect this growth within the Asian American community. Several decades ago, ALDEF litigated a federal redistricting litigation called Diaz v. Silver, where the court agreed that there was an Asian American community of interest between Brooklyn Sunset Park and Manhattan's Chinatown. We expect that this precedent will continue as it was in the last round, and that the 7th Congressional District's boundaries will reflect this community of interest. We also expect that the process will preserve other districts that finally, in some cases for the first time, allowed Asian Americans to elect a candidate of their choice, including the 6th Congressional District, which was drawn by the court in the last redistricting round. Prior to 2012, despite having over 1 million Asian American residents in New York City, New York State had never elected an Asian American to Congress. Only after the court drew a fair district centered in Flushing that kept Asian American communities of interest together and whole, that was the very first time Asian Americans were able to elect a candidate of its choice, which happened just several months later after that district was drawn, and that is the 6th Congressional District. We also, unfortunately, prior to the last redistricting round, had several Asian American communities of interest that were divided unlike any other communities in the city. You have a community like Richmond Hill in South Ozone Park, in Southern Queens, an Indo-Caribbean community that was divided into six assembly districts. Elmhurst, Queens, which was divided into 5 assembly districts. This voter disenfranchisement cannot continue, and we call on the Independent Redistricting Commission to right these wrongs and put the Asian American community on equal footing as other communities. We call on the commission to comply with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to draw Asian American majority districts at the state assembly, state senate, and congressional level where appropriate and where compliance is required. We call on the commission to follow one person, one vote. We know of all the problems that occurred in the last round, from the severe malapportionment that discriminated against downstate voters of color and residents of color and resulted in 1 1/7 state senate district being migrated upstate where there was less population growth than there was downstate. We are simply asking that Asian American communities be kept whole at all legislative levels so that Asian Americans can be treated equally as other groups and can elect candidates of its choice in compliance with the Voting Rights Act, US Constitution, and New York State Constitution. We thank you, the League of Women Voters, for your time and for having this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Next, we'll hear from Perry Grossman, Voting Rights Project Attorney for the New York Civil Liberties Union.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be invited and a pleasure to be here with so many august colleagues. And certainly I want to make sure that I echo a lot of what they say, but to avoid redundancy, I'll keep it brief. So, the New York Civil Liberties Union is obviously deeply dedicated to protecting the voting rights of all New Yorkers. We are glad to finally see the principles of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act expressly reflected in the New York State Constitution, including the requirement that the commission and any subsequent redistricting reflect consider whether the lines would result in the denial or abridgment of racial or language minority voting rights, and to ensure that voters of color have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and to elect candidates of their choice. Obviously, we will have more thoughts on this as we get the census data that Jeff referred to, which is a little bit delayed. But we look forward to a transparent process where members of the community are able to describe the interests that their communities have with specificity and the hearings required all over the state. We expect the commission to be fully and adequately funded so that data is able to be used in the most transparent and useful possible way to produce an equitable map. And I would just like to take the opportunity to commend all of the community groups and outreach workers who put so much effort into getting New Yorkers to come out for the census, because while we've heard several times that New York will lose a congressional seat, and while it is disappointing that New York is about 89 people shy of not losing any congressional seats, it is a testament to everyone who put so much effort into the count that we are not losing 2 congressional seats. So happy to look on the bright side of things there. But overall, we look forward to a transparent and inclusive process that ensures that, that the Voting Rights Act is respected, that the values enshrined in the New York State Constitution are respected. And we look forward to working with our partners to hold the commission and the legislature accountable for a fair map. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Perry. Next, we'll hear from Julio Rivera, Civic Engagement Program Manager for National Programs for NALEO Educational Fund.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for giving us an opportunity to provide some comments today. As Jennifer said, my name is Julio Rivera. I'm the Civic Engagement Program Manager for NALEO Educational Fund. NALEO Educational Fund is the nation's leading 501c3 nonprofit organization that facilitates the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. And a key part of that process is the decennial census and redistricting. Since 1990, NALEO Educational Fund has engaged in campaigns to promote a full and accurate count of the Latino population in the decennial census. And in 2020, we held our largest campaign to date, known as Hágase Contar. Now that we have received the initial census data and apportionment counts, all of those efforts must now translate into ensuring the Latino community is accurately and fairly represented in the redistricting process. Our Latinos Draw the Lines campaign is working to protect the voting rights and electoral opportunities of the Latino community in redistricting. We began our efforts here in New York to ensure fair representation by advocating for the appointment of a Latina to the Independent Redistricting Commission. We collaborated then, and we continue to work closely with groups such as Latino Justice Pearl Deaf in order to mobilize Latinos and support their efforts in unity mapping. We believe the most important principles in the redistricting process are: 1, keeping elected officials accountable to their communities; 2, compliance with the Constitution; compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act; the preservation and respect for communities of interest; and lastly, the transparency and meaningful opportunities for the public to participate and be heard. Who represents you matters, and it affects your family, your neighborhood, and your community. Redistricting and how the lines are drawn determines whether different population groups have a say in the outcomes of elections. Redrawn state legislative and congressional maps must provide Latinos a fair opportunity to choose their representatives. So as we collectively begin working to mobilize communities to engage on redistricting, organizers should keep a few things in mind. First, that redistricting is a relatively complicated form of civic engagement. It requires some knowledge of what can be a highly technical process. So the census and nonpartisan voter engagement is a valuable starting place. We want to avoid what could be known as democracy burnout. This process is coming after a year of engagement on the census and on elections. And for places like New York City, it's also in the midst of ongoing municipal elections. It is therefore important to begin with the values behind our work, the importance of having accountable elected officials and how this affects your community. This should come before talking about what the process is and how to become involved. It's also important to use plain language in your materials and presentations, because using jargon will create barriers to engagement as well. And lastly, please ensure that your outreach work is culturally and linguistically competent. So as this process unfolds, groups such as ours and others on this call will need to continue close collaboration. New York's complex demographics means drawing maps that ensure a fair outcome for all underrepresented communities will be challenging. So transparency about difficult choices and open communication will be necessary to ensure all communities of interest are respected and fairly represented. So thank you once again to the League of Women Voters for this opportunity.
Thank you, Julio. Next, we'll hear from Helen Helmuth, Senior Advocate for Disability Rights New York.
Thanks, Jennifer. Disability Rights New York is a protection and advocacy agency for New York State. DRNY advocates for the civil and legal rights of New Yorkers with disabilities. Our protection and advocacy for voter access program serves to make the voting process accessible for people with disabilities and educates individuals with disabilities about their rights as voters. Before this testimony, I reached out to individuals with disabilities and other members of the disability community to ask about the most common issues they are currently facing. Overwhelmingly, people mentioned issues involving direct support staff and home health care aides. Direct support staff work for individuals with disabilities and assist them with activities of daily living like bathing, dressing, toileting, cooking meals, and feeding, as well as other supportive services. These workers provide an intimate and essential service. However, home healthcare aides are only typically paid about $12 to $15 an hour, which creates a negative domino effect. To start, the community-based direct workforce is at a crisis level shortage. Because of the workforce shortage, it is difficult to find quality staff for self-directed services. Community activities are frequently canceled because there are not enough staff available to accompany house members, creating a sense of cabin fever. Lastly, staff are forced to work overtime, which results in them becoming tired and less patient with the people they serve, leading to workplace burnout. Police brutality is another unfortunate common issue affecting people with disabilities. Individuals with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed during a police interaction than other civilians approached or stopped by law enforcement. And a minimum of 1 in 4 fatal police encounters ends the life of an individual with severe mental illness. People with disabilities are disproportionately more likely to be victims of police violence. Ultimately, people with disabilities continue to face a barrage of barriers on a daily basis, including being paid sub-minimum wage, not having reliable access to accessible transportation, lack of affordable, accessible housing options, barriers to employment, in general, inaccessibility of the streets and buildings of New York State, including polling places. As we know, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act mandates that electoral district lines must be drawn in a way to protect minority rights. DRNY recommends that the Redistricting Commission also commit to drawing electoral lines to protect the interests of the disability community. This will involve the Redistricting Commission advocating that the disability census data be released at the same time as the race census data. If the disability community wants to have an equal chance of electing officials who will advocate for the changes most impacting their community, including increasing budgets for direct support staff and mindful appointment of city police chiefs, then electoral districts must be drawn in a way where people with disabilities are fairly represented. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my testimony.
Thank you, Helen. Next, we'll hear from Asha Ross, Senior Strategist to the New York Immigration Coalition.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing this meeting and this hearing. I'm Asha Ross, Senior Strategist at NYIC Action, which is a 501c4 organization and the sister organization of the New York Immigration Coalition. NYIC Action was founded in 2007 to increase the political power of the immigrant vote, and for the next 2 years, we'll be heavily engaged in redistricting through a campaign that we're calling Mapping Our Future. Over the next 2 years, we have an opportunity to redraw New York's political maps, end partisan gerrymandering, and build a decade of political power for the roughly 1 in 4 New Yorkers who are immigrants. The redistricting fight is Census 2.0, and it's a major reason why we fought so hard to get a complete count. A fair count enables the drawing of fair districts, which leads to fair representation. As with the census, the opportunity to draw fair districts only comes every 10 years. There are no do-overs. If we don't get this right, our communities have to live with the consequences of that for the next decade. In prior redistricting cycles, elected officials of both parties engaged in gerrymandering tactics such as packing and cracking. This results in districts that are designed to dilute the voting strength of communities of color, prevent competitive elections, and otherwise keep incumbents safely in their seats. If candidates and elected officials know they can safely ignore certain communities, they often do just that. District maps that make it impossible for communities to elect their own members often mean a decade of having the needs of that community deprioritized. Additionally, it means that some incumbents simply don't feel the pressure that advocacy organizations can bring. Our work on fair and humane immigration policies, affordable housing, police reform, and so much more is made harder because some incumbents feel untouchable. But good redistricting processes can remedy that. Well-drawn districts that keep communities of interest together can protect New York's immigrants and communities of color, allow challengers to have a fair shot at winning elections, and energize civic engagement. Our goal at NYSE and NYSE Action is to mobilize our statewide and regional grassroots members and partners, and to elevate the voices and the needs of immigrant New Yorkers in the redistricting process. We'll be working with traditional and ethnic media to highlight the redistricting effort in all communities across the state, organizing community education events, creating educational materials, mobilizing around all hearings of the Redistricting Commission, and engaging with elected officials. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but this is a great start to remedying some of the mistakes of the past and mapping a future that works for all New Yorkers. Thank you again to the League of Women Voters and the many partners who are in this fight.
Thank you, Asher. Next, we'll hear from Emily Paez, Director of Government Affairs and Civic Engagement to the Hispanic Federation.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Again, as you mentioned, my name is Emily Paez, and I am the Director of Government Affairs and Civic Engagement with Hispanic Federation. Thank you, and to the National League of Women Voters for the opportunity to testify today at the People's Hearing on Redistricting. So since its inception, Hispanic Federation's mission has been to empower and advance the Hispanic community. And several decades later, Hispanic Federation continues to be a leading force in the battle to have a fair and accountable government. As one of the nation's top Latino nonprofit organizations, Hispanic Federation works its network of Hispanic nonprofits, grassroots leaders, and media partners to empower and advance Latinos across the United States. Through our programmatic efforts, Hispanic Federation serves our community in areas of civic engagement, health, education, economic empowerment, and immigration. Following each decennial census, Hispanic Federation has been on the front lines, advocating for Latino voices to be heard and included in the reappropriation and redistricting process. This includes educational advocacy around census participation. In 2020 alone, Hispanic Federation reached out to millions of Latino New Yorkers using culturally competent outreach measures in the height of a global health pandemic. Hispanic Federation worked with vulnerable Latino immigrant communities to be counted in spite of the fear instilled by misinformation, reassuring them that census participation will not only not be used against them, that the data collected is protected by federal law, adding to the importance of federal resources and representations needed in our communities. New York State is going to be losing a congressional seat, and many have lost their representation at our federal level because of 89 seats, people not being counted, as has been mentioned. Despite this being the best of the worst case scenarios, this is a result of poor investments and resources provided to communities that need them the most throughout the entire state. In the last 20 years, the state of New York has lost 5 seats in Congress. And whether those seats come from upstate or the city, the effect is the same: dilution of power and less representation, especially in communities of color. We can do better. New York State has seen a dramatic growth in Latino population over the last few decades, with 3.5 million or 19% of the population communities that need. population identifying as Hispanic. It is not an exaggeration to say that redistricting will affect millions of Latinos in the state, and yet it is not a topic that is top of mind for our communities. Communicating directly with grassroots leaders is critical and important as they are trusted messengers in our communities. New York State should be compelled to advance the process for redrawing district boundaries that puts our communities first by investing in resources, capacity, and time necessary for drawing district boundaries that puts our community first. We must ensure that our communities are included at every level of government and decision-making processes, that the systems and processes by which they choose to draw the lines are transparent, fair, representative, and there are shared information in culturally competent manners. The start is closely monitoring the development and efforts of the newly established Independent Redistricting Commission. Alongside other Latino organizations joined here today, Hispanic Federation decried the lack of Latino representation in the commission. While we applaud the addition of the only Latina member in the commission, we also acknowledge that her representation is part of the outcome of the advocates and organizations banding together to demand inclusion and more representation within the commission. We must also ensure that funds allocated to the Independent Redistricting Commission are sufficient and distributed in a timely manner. This is critical for the functionality and the independent redistricting and the intent to break through historical inequities and sustain unethical practices like gerrymandering. We must hold them accountable to that commitment. We look forward to collectively working together towards achieving a fair and equitable redistricting process that is reflective of the dramatic growth of communities of color in New York, allowing all communities the opportunity to have a fair representation and to have candidates that reflect their ideas and that help meet the needs of their community. Again, thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you, Emily. Next, we'll hear from Sandra Choi, Civic Participation Manager for the Mikwan Center for Community Action.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for bringing us all together here tonight. My name is Sandra Choi, and I am the Civic Participation Manager at the Mikwan Center for Community Action. Mikwan is also the convening organization for the APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. Since our founding in 1984, Mikwan has had a profound impact on the communities that we serve. Based in Queens, we provide direct social services to low-income and limited English proficient residents in Flushing and cultivate the next generation of civic leaders. Mikwan also empowers and organizes our members on key issues, including comprehensive immigration and housing reform. Through our organization's civic participation, advocacy, and outreach, we build community and immigrant power by protecting and elevating the voices of the most marginalized to keep elected officials accountable. We know redistricting will have an immeasurable impact on how and which communities are represented on each level of government. The redistricting process must be rooted in preserving our communities together because dividing them will dilute the voice and power of our communities. This week, while the Census Bureau announced that New York State lost one congressional seat due to national demographic shifts, Asian Americans continue to be the fastest growing population here in Queens and in New York State. In Queens, Asian Americans alone make up 26% of the population's borough, and over a 10-year period, the population has grown from 548,000 to 589,000 in 2019. In New York State, the Asian American population has exhibited a similar demographic shift, with the population growing from 1.4 million to 1.6 million during the same time period. As a result of the 2010 redistricting cycle, downtown Flushing was preserved in one state assembly district. Because our community is located within one geographic area, it made it possible to coordinate more efficiently with advocates, neighborhood groups, government agencies, and leaders to do voter and census outreach. More recently, this configuration also allowed us to develop and implement a coordinated pandemic response to meet their needs with our partners. We also recently launched the Flushing Community Fridge that serves as a food pantry for local residents to address food insecurity in our neighborhoods. At Mikwan, we witnessed firsthand how the pandemic has exacerbated the existing inequalities throughout our housing, healthcare, economic, and education systems. Many members we serve work survival jobs in the hospitality industry or as home care attendants, taxi cab and rideshare drivers, nail salon technicians, and small business owners. 1 in 4 Asian American elders live in poverty, and many working class immigrants in neighborhoods like Flushing are at grave risk of displacement with predatory landlords and development projects that accelerate gentrification. With over 80% being foreign born, linguistic isolation is high, along with high rates of uninsured or underinsured residents. Our communities need to stay together in order for us to advocate collectively for the resources and policies that address these needs. Mikwan stands with our APA Voice Redistricting Task Force members to ensure that this process results in fair maps that builds the power of communities of color, not dilute it. We should be able to elect the candidate of our choice who will be the most responsive and accountable to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Next, we'll hear from Aminda Kilawan Narine, founder and executive director of South Queens Women's March.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aminda Kilawan Narine, and I am a lawyer, an organizer, and the founder and executive director of South Queens Women's March, a local grassroots gender justice organization. Founded right before the pandemic hit and inspired by a global and national women's rights movements, South Queens Women's March amplifies the voices of South Queens' diverse women and gender expansive people. We are an all-volunteer, multi-generational, intersectional platform working to foster women's empowerment through dismantling norms, practices, and institutions that support patriarchy and gender injustice. We take our sisterhood to the streets to unify women and gender nonconforming individuals in our community and connect them to the tools and resources necessary to empower their lives and to thrive. Women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and we recognize the need to meet women, girls, and gender fluid people where they are. Community members have ended up practically trapped at home with their abusers. Reprieve is far from reachable, and resources become that much more critical. So we provide food pantries and essential distributions to meet our community members where they are, reaching several thousand local families. We have hosted monthly workshops on healthy relationships and wellness to support survivors coping with trauma, fostering self-love, addressing street harassment, and how to have healthy, intimate relationships. We offer youth and professional development workshops to immigrant families who don't have access to quality information to support their educational and career development. They're often in first generation families, learning for the first time how to navigate complex systems and bureaucracies. And finally, we're building political power from the ground up, utilizing ethnic and community media as a platform for civic engagement and education, street canvassing to register voters, and raising our voices to educate our communities and decision-making bodies on how we have been historically oppressed. And that includes placed in multiple districts that dilute our power. To that end, South Queens Women's March is a proud member of APA Voices Redistricting Task Force. Much of our work, which has grown exponentially over the short year plus of our existence, has been based in Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, and the Jamaica neighborhoods of South Queens, home to a vibrant and sprawling South Asian and Indo-Caribbean population that census data unfortunately cannot fully account for. These communities have been gerrymandered for far too long. I began to organize in my community a decade ago, actually during the 2010 redistricting cycle. And 10 years later, I find myself asking for the same thing. Please don't divide us, keep our communities of interest together. If you take a look at the district lines at every level of government for these neighborhoods, you will see a blatant disregard for the natural communities of interest that exist. You'll see lines that don't uphold the Voting Rights Act, but instead run afoul of them, not compact nor contiguous by any means. The communities that are fragmented into 2, 3, 4, 5, and yes, 6 more districts are interwoven. They're linked by strong ties, whether those be cultural, culinary, familial, religious, educational, economic, and more. We take the same trains and buses, we go to the same schools, We face the same financial struggles. We're even extensions of the same families, yet the lines divide us in a way that dilutes our ability to be a stronger voice. For instance, if our communities of interest were kept whole, we wouldn't be struggling to get the adequate sanitation and garbage bins on our major thoroughfares. If our communities of interest were kept whole, we could advocate more to effectively address the housing crisis that prices our people out of becoming homeowners in our own neighborhoods or living in basement apartments because there really is nowhere else to go. If our communities of interest were kept whole, we would have a true community and recreational center and not be forced to find alternatives like the local Burger King or our local libraries, which themselves are in need of capital repairs. This is not about identity politics. It's about protecting disenfranchised populations. This is about eradicating voter dilution. This is about community empowerment. So thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for creating this platform. And as we say always at South Queens Women's March, our voice is our power. Thank you.
Thank you, Amita. Next, we'll hear from Ramdan Singh, Director of Civic Engagement for the Caribbean Equality Project.
Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Ramdat Singh. I'm a proud public school teacher, and I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for the Caribbean Equality Project. CEP is a proud coalition member of APA Voice Redistricting Task Force, founded in 2015 in response to anti-LGBTQ+ hate in Richmond Hill, Queens, New York. CEP is a community board-based organization that empowers Black and Brown LGBTQ+ Caribbean immigrants in New York City. Through public education, community organizing, civic engagement, storytelling, and cultural and social programming, the organization's work focuses on advocacy for LGBTQ+ people. We work to promote and defend immigrant rights, gender equity, racial justice, mental health services, and ending hate violence in the Caribbean diaspora. For the past 5 years, the Caribbean Equality Project's civic engagement work has focused on building political power through voter education campaigns, co-hosting candidate forums, and voter registration drives. The Caribbean LGBTQ+ people community is part of the larger Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean diasporas. In 2020, we launched our own culturally responsive census outreach to get the counts out in our Caribbean communities around New York City. This year, our civic engagement organizing includes redistricting because we understand what it takes and means to be excluded while experiencing housing discrimination and employment disparities. New York City is home to both the largest South Asian and Indo-Caribbean, Guyanese, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Surinamese, etc. diasporic populations, a contributor to the city's economy, language, and cultural diversity, and a growing political power machine. Due to British colonialism in the Caribbeans who are of South Asian descent were forced into indentured servitude by unclear contracts and lack of language access. After surviving decades of displacement, class struggles, ancestral traumas, and harm, the Indian diaspora has used their bodies, voices, music, and other interdisciplinary mediums to preserve religious traditions and culture, including right here in the Bronx and in Queens. The Indo-Caribbean population has grown exponentially in Queens and the Bronx. Richmond Hill, also known as Little Guyana, is home to the largest Indo-Caribbean community, with the Castle Hill section of the Bronx coming in second. Unfortunately, as Aminda mentioned, the census data will not adequately reflect the total Indo-Caribbean population in New York City. This complex history of belonging and migration have led to inadequate census counts because some Indo-Caribbeans were forced to classify themselves as Asian, while others select other on government documents. Due to this complicated history, there are discrepancies with locating the total number of Indo-Caribbeans and Caribbeans in New York City. In the area known as Little Guyana and Richmond Hills, South Ozone Park, the district is divided into 6 legislative districts, which are Assembly Districts 23, 24, 28, 31, and 32. In the early 2000s, there was a housing mortgage crisis for thousands of homeowners in the area. Because our community was divided into several assembly districts, these homeowners could not get the necessary help from their elected officials because their numbers were smaller. The elected officials ignored their concerns, and these homeowners did not receive the help until it became a national housing crisis. This is one example of when a community with shared culture, values, and socioeconomic backgrounds is split and dilutes their political power. It has a negative impact on the community and the residents living in that community. We want the Independent Redistricting Commission to keep our communities of interest together in Richmond Hill, South Folsom Park in Queens, and Soundview, Castle Hill in the Bronx. We must have a fair and transparent redistricting process with our representation at the center of the dialogue with fair maps. Thank you so much, and we thank the League of Women Voters for inviting us as panelists.
Thank you, Ramdat. Next, we'll hear from Manyaku, Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff to the Academy of Medical Health and Public Services.
Thank you to the League of Women Voters for the opportunity to testify tonight. My name is Manyaku. I am the Executive Vice President at the Academy of Medical and Public Health Services, otherwise known as AMPS. AMPS is a not-for-profit public health organization in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and a member of APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. We bridge the health equity gap among communities of color by providing free clinical screenings, bilingual mental health therapy, individualized health education, and social services for immigrant populations in the Latinx and Chinese communities, regardless of their immigration status or ability to pay. South Brooklyn is perhaps one of the most divided in terms of Senate and Assembly districts. Sunset Park itself is divided into 2 Assembly districts, 51 and 49, which also includes Bensonhurst and Dagger Heights. We support keeping Sunset Park and Bensonhurst in the same Assembly district, 8049. The Asian community in this district is essentially large, compact, and cohesive to be able to elect a candidate of their choice. However, there are opportunities for the expanding Asian population in 8051 to be consolidated with 8049. Sunset Park is currently divided into 3 separate Senate districts, with the Asian community divided into 2. District 20, which primarily consists of Brownsville and Crown Heights, and District 17, which primarily consists of Borough Park and Midwood. Because of language barriers and lack of a direct subway line connecting Sunset Park to these neighborhoods, there are limited connecting factors between them. Moreover, the culturally sensitive services our communities rely on are located in Sunset Park and Bensonhurst. Divided, Sunset Park will receive fewer resources. We have seen that translated into overcrowded schools, lack of affordable housing, increased homelessness rates, and rising food insecurity and unemployment. We recommend unifying communities of interest in Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, and Homecrest in 1 state Senate district. Working in the South Brooklyn community for the past 11 years, we have observed a considerable growth in the Asian immigrant community since redistricting a decade ago. Across the city, 78% of the APAs are foreign-born. The social challenges created by language disparities are consistent across neighborhoods. A large majority of non-citizens in Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, and Homecrest have low English proficiency at 85%, 82%, and 73% respectively. These South Brooklyn communities are connected by a need for linguistically and culturally appropriate services. During COVID-19, for example, our organization, located in Sunset Park, received hundreds of calls from community members from across these 3 neighborhoods seeking assistance with public benefits, vaccine appointments, and testing, because we were able to offer help in their language. NYU Langone and their federally qualified health centers in Sunset Park, one of the largest hospitals in South Brooklyn, similarly offers in-language services that attract Chinese speakers across these communities. And these neighborhoods are also home to a bustling array of educational programs that attract Chinese students across Brooklyn. 3 popular weekend Chinese school programs teaching young children to embrace their culture, heritage, and language are spread out across Sunset Park and Bensonhurst. Nearly a third of our AMPS ESOL students hail from Bensonhurst and 10% from Homecrest, though again, we are located in Sunset Park. Many of our clients also find work opportunities across communities, connected by the NDR subway lines and 65th and 60th Streets by car. The migratory nature of these communities reflect the growing need of our communities to stay together through fair and cohesive representation. And finally, the recent anti-Asian hate crimes perpetrated against our communities point to an urgent need to have a voice that represents and protects us. A more equitable redistricting process will mean that we can streamline resources in a time when our communities are most vulnerable. Thank you again for this opportunity to share our thoughts with you all.
Thank you, Manyak. Next, we'll hear from Laurie Daniel Favors, Executive Director for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Laurie Daniel Favors, and I am a racial justice attorney and the interim executive director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, CUNY. Our mission at CLSJ is to address racial justice issues by providing quality legal advocacy, conducting community education campaigns, facilitating research, and building organizing capacity on behalf of New Yorkers of African descent and the disenfranchised. And we very much appreciate the work that the League of Women Voters New York put into this event and for the ability to present our testimony this evening. CLSJ launched into this redistricting cycle propelled by our advocacy in the 2020 census campaign and by the depth of institutional knowledge that we bring to bear as a result of our involvement in 3 previous redistricting cycles, where our organization played a pivotal role in advocating on behalf of New Yorkers of African descent in order to protect their right to live in districts that are drawn equitably and which keep our communities of interest intact and which give our communities the ability to elect candidates of their choice. That history includes one of my favorite ongoing collaborations, which is a collaboration with our partners at the Asian American Legal Defense Fund and Latino Justice Pearl Deaf in the Unity Maps project. We were also motivated by our knowledge that this redistricting process is not going to be protected by the Section 5 preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And as a result of that, communities of African descent, communities of color, and the disenfranchised, frankly, are exposed, vulnerable, and at risk. Building on our Census Coalition, which took place under the banner of the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020, CLSJ provided redistricting trainings, conducted community informational meetings, and met with hundreds of people, both as we were winding down our census campaign and thereafter when we launched our redistricting project in order to fully prepare our community to participate in this process. Why? Because communities of African descent, like all New York City communities, deserve equitably drawn districts that empower voters of African descent to elect candidates of their choice without having the strength of their votes diluted and under the full protection of the Constitution. But as we all know, deserving rights as people of color in this society means absolutely nothing if we are not prepared to fight for them. We have seen repeatedly how communities of African descent, Latinx communities, and Asian American AAPI communities all across this country have been driving population growth in states all across this country. And yet, due to a lack of community familiarity with the redistricting process, our population growth is rarely rewarded with equitably drawn maps that reflect that growth and which protect our communities. In that effort, which is ongoing and is going to be launching in phase 2 in just a month or so, CLSJ recently concluded a 6-week community redistricting course called Draw Maps and Build Power, which was led by our project's head of research, Dr. Zalima Blair at Medgar Evers College. The goal of this course was to ensure our community knows how to access and how to use census data for community advocacy during redistricting and understanding the basics of the redistricting process and how to fully and equitably participate. We continue to gather data to submit to redistricting authorities and intend to be wholly involved in the process for redistricting in the state and the city. It is vitally important that the Redistricting Commission have accurate information and that communities of interest are protected and not harmed in this process. We need and will indeed fight for and defend equitable redistricting that does not dilute the power of communities which are recognized and protected by the Voting Rights Act in New York City, the lack of pre-clearance provision protection notwithstanding. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this event. And I very much look forward to working with the organizations present here as we continue to ensure that all New Yorkers are able to live, grow, breathe, play, work, and function in communities that are whole and that are sustained and protected and are not disassembled through the process we all come to know and love as redistricting. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and to contribute to this event.
Thank you, Laurie. Next, we'll hear from Sue Ruff, Advocacy Director for the Southern Tier Independent Center.
Thank you, League of Women Voters, for this opportunity tonight. Why does redistricting matter to people with disabilities? Well, let's start by looking at challenges and barriers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you have a disability. Southern Tier Independent Center, established in 1983, is based in Binghamton, but we provide programs and services for people with all types of disabilities. And we work in the South Central area of New York State. At this time, Our greatest needs revolve around keeping people with disabilities in their own homes and out of nursing facilities and other segregated congregate settings. More than 15,000 people in the state have died of COVID in these settings. Finding affordable and accessible housing is extremely difficult, and in some communities, it's impossible. Finding home care workers is even harder, partly because of state policies and partly due to the lack of fair pay for them. In July, the minimum wage for fast food workers is going up to $15 an hour, but the pay for home care workers north of Westchester is staying at $12.50. This means the very real and serious shortage of personal care workers will become even greater. Without home care workers, people end up institutionalized. There's another group of people who are also struggling. They are the individuals with disabilities who end up in county jails, some because their support needs are not met in the community. For perspective, last month, there were 10,141 unsentenced people residing in New York State jails, most of whom are eligible to vote. Last November, when most of us went to the polls, that number was 9,561. We have heard from district attorneys, public defenders, and even the justification memo on New York State Bill S-2209-A-540 that more than 80% of the people who are incarcerated have disabilities. Unsentenced but in jail means they are not adjudicated and not out on bail. Most have likely lost jobs, apartments, and sometimes their children. Although legally able to vote, there are almost no provisions to register and vote by absentee ballot in almost all the state's jails. Would these potential voters affect local, state, and federal elections? Yes. We have worked very hard to assist people with their voting rights, to make polling place locations accessible, to find employment opportunities, because 70% of people with disabilities who want to work cannot find jobs. Healthcare needs, housing searches, educational rights, transportation, community access. However, our biggest challenge, more than 30 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, remains the ongoing battle for people to live in their own homes, in their own communities, with the supports and services that they need. This is a civil rights battle. While some elected officials have heard our voices, many continue to ignore the nearly 20% of New York citizens with disabilities. We are your family members, your neighbors, your students, your employees, and your fellow citizens. But for very many of us, the future does not hold the promise of freedom or self-determination. It holds the threat of institutionalization, whether we live in urban or rural areas. We care about the fair and objective drawing of district lines because we understand how hard we will have to continue to educate the people who will be elected to serve us all. The people who decide every year what is included in local, state, and national budgets and legislation, and what is left behind on the cutting room floor. Thank you again, League of Women Voters, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sue. Next, we'll hear from April Land, member of the Capital Region One Person, One Vote Coalition. April, we see you, but we can't hear your audio.
Good evening.
Oh, I heard you, sorry.
So I'll start again if that's okay. Good evening. My name is April Land, and I represent the One Person, One Vote Coalition of the Capital District as a member of the Capital Area Urban League. Since 2018, the coalition has been committed to the adoption of an equitable redistricting plan produced through a transparent, participatory, and fair process. Let me first describe our community where we share common interests, such as damage to our environmental resources, and the location of our state capital. In the Capital District, there are 3 distinct and geographically separated cities, Albany, Troy, and Schenectady. All share common issues, including poverty, inadequate housing, poor schools, and policing. There's been a failure to meet the needs of low-income residents in all areas, including in smaller municipalities located in our expansive peri-urban, suburban, and rural areas. Also, there is a lack of reliable and affordable broadband, especially in rural areas. High-speed internet connectivity is fundamental for economic activity and to bridge the digital divide. What is unique about our community is that ours includes the state capital, making it the center of state government. Our major employers are state government and educational and healthcare institutions. Much of that is exempt from real property taxes. While many upstate areas have lost population, we've seen significant population changes in recent years. There's been an influx of immigrants and people relocating from New York City. Also, tech companies are increasing. The demographic changes have exacerbated pre-existing unaddressed issues, like the lack of support for underfunded municipal governments, including unfunded mandates. Significant systemic issues have also impacted our community. Historically, corporate and political interests have obstructed the ability of our voters to have a meaningful voice and equal representation. Our diverse community needs to be able to define and address issues in its own way. The new redistricting process gives us an opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past, where voices of people were not equally heard or weighted. Our highest and best hope for this process is that it challenges those who've been silent or silenced in the past to voice their concerns. Our political leadership needs to reflect the community, so participation and decision-making comes from the electorate. Our group's purpose is to educate the public on the importance of redistricting and encouraging engagement, provide training, partner with Representable to initiate community mapping drives for historically underserved communities, to have the information and tools that they need to participate fully and meaningfully in redistricting, identify issues that impact communities of color, the environment, and social justice, and to advocate for transparency and equity throughout the redistricting process. We expect to review maps, submit our own, and hold the commission accountable for fair mapping. An Urban League member coined the term kitchen table maps that the One Person One Vote Coalition has adopted. We believe that our voters should be at the table drawing our own maps, determining fair and equitable districts that ensure one person, one vote. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, April. Next, we'll hear from Kathy Stein, President for the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. Where am I? My slideshow. Well, greetings from the North Country. St. Lawrence County could be New York's poster child for gerrymandering at the state level. With 4 Assembly and 3 state Senate seats, the county has been sliced and diced into small parcels without regard to the integrity of the community, its economic resources, or its partisan disposition. Voters with common interests have no way to express them in a politically coherent way through their elected representatives. St. Lawrence, whose population is just under 108,000, is divided among 4 assembly districts. Not one of our currently elected assembly members lives in our county. With the exception of Jefferson County to our immediate east, No other counties in the North Country are more, other counties in the North Country are more or less intact in their districts. We are divided, as I said, among 3 Senate districts. Only one of our state senators calls St. Lawrence County home. Again, no other North Country county is as subdivided as we are. The 2 largest non-agricultural employers in the county are education and health. With our 17 school districts parceled out among 7 electoral districts, it is impossible to politically consolidate our interests regarding primary and secondary education. We have 4 major universities within a 10-mile radius, yet their division among 3 assembly and 2 senatorial districts effectively disenfranchises our higher education community. Our major healthcare providers are similarly split between several state representatives. The county is the center of gravity for none of these legislative districts. So the only time we see most of our elected representatives, if at all, is during election season. They don't need the votes from our county to retain their seats, so they tend to ignore us. All but one of our state representatives are Republicans. This does not accurately reflect the political demographics of the county, which is more evenly split between Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and other parties. If our political boundaries conformed to those of our county, candidates seeking to represent St. Lawrence would have to address the concerns of a broader swath of the electorate. The problems St. Lawrence County faces are those common to other rural counties in New York, including inadequate public transportation, high poverty rate, inadequate childcare and elder care, food deserts, scarcity of accessible and affordable broadband, not enough good paying jobs, high cost to the county for Medicaid and other services needed to supplement family incomes. Nevertheless, we are compelled to contact 7 different state representatives on any issue of countywide concern. To say the least, this situation does not foster effective advocacy. According to the most recent poll by Jefferson County Community College, St. Lawrence County alone among neighboring counties showed a marked drop in residents' opinion of the overall quality of life in their community. Due to the pandemic, pollsters expected a drop in outlook for all 3 of the counties that were surveyed, but instead found only in St. Lawrence a drop. Clearly, the residents feel that their county is a distinct entity. We therefore petition the Redistricting Commission to factor in the geographical integrity of our county when considering the revision of district boundaries. The current electoral map denies us the coherent political identity that St. Lawrence County needs. Thank you, and I will stop my share here.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Next, we'll hear from Kathy Meany, President of the League of Women Voters of Westchester County.
Good evening. Yes, I'm Kathy Meany, President of the League of Women Voters of Westchester County. Our league appreciates this opportunity to comment on the redistricting efforts that will soon take place for all U.S. congressional districts and our New York State Senate and Assembly districts. And you'll note that several of our Westchester County districts include Rockland, Putnam, Orange, Dutchess, and Bronx counties. We thank the League of Women Voters of New York State for being steadfast stewards in advocating for the development and funding of the Independent Redistricting Commission and providing our members with additional information and insight. While our league recognizes the legal constraints involved in shaping legislative districts, we oppose partisanship gerrymandering because it strips rights away from voters. The Westchester League on all levels is laser focused on this decennial exercise following the census, with the goal to combat gerrymandered districts which benefit politicians and political parties rather than citizens. We are actively working here in Westchester to help create people-powered fair maps. Our message is to get everyone to think about the priorities of communities of interest so that elected representatives truly represent their constituency and work for them. Our message for legislators and the members of the IRC: your leadership will be key in consulting with communities of interest, hearing from the people, and drawing fair maps. Why is fair mapping important to Westchester County? Well, we're a diverse county, and we offer much variety with many communities of interest that cross municipalities. Community groups and organizations have particular interests and want to have their elected representatives prioritize those interests. Those interests could center around geography, such as the Long Island Sound and the Hudson River, or cities in the southern part of our county, as well as the heavily wooded areas in the north. Or it could even be institutions such as schools, prisons, medical facilities, or even concerns such as economic development, affordable housing, racial equity, high tax rates, environmental issues, transportation concerns, food insecurity, just to name a few. We recommend being aggregated with others in a community who share interest. I'll share a few examples with you. Larchmont and Mamaroneck are our Long Island Sound shore communities, and environmental issues relating to the Long Island Sound are really important to those citizens. But the northern parts of the Senate and Assembly districts and 95% of Congressional District 17 don't share those concerns to the same extent. Ossining Town and Village in Westchester is a diverse community that faces economic challenges. Why would Senate District 38 be interested in that small community on the other side of the Hudson River? 90% of this district encompasses Rockland County. And another example, White Plains. White Plains is a city within Westchester County, yet is divided into two Senate districts, 35 and 37. How can interests and challenges be addressed when divided? Currently, CD 18 comprises 4 counties: Westchester, Putnam, Orange, and Dutchess. How can that mapping fairly meet the needs of those communities? CD 17 is split down the middle by the Hudson River, yet it includes both Westchester and Rockland counties. How can that fairly meet the needs of those diverse communities? And CD 16 shares its map with Bronx County of New York City. How can that map fairly meet the needs of those diverse communities? The League of Women Voters of Westchester asks that legislators and the IRC focus upon the needs of community citizens by actively listening to them and not holding a political lens upon mapping. The people want their voices heard and expect those whom they elect to represent them to actively listen, accurately represent their voices, and take actions to meet their needs. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Eileen Lilly, member of the League of Women Voters of Nassau County. Eileen, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Just muted.
I'll start over. My name is Eileen Lilly. In 2011, as a new member of the League of Women Voters of Long Beach, I attended the Nassau County Legislature meeting on redistricting. I had become involved in the League of Women Voters after working in a school district as the district clerk, where I was responsible for school board and library board budget votes and elections. Redistricting would be another lesson for me to learn in how democracy functions. It was an opportunity to learn to support League of Women Voters and the city of Long Beach, my community, and Nassau County. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan political organization whose primary purpose is to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in their government. League-sponsored candidate events serve to educate the public, motivate voters to participate in the elections and give voters a chance to hear the views of the candidates. The League never supports or opposes candidates or political parties. In 2011, as we League members sat in the crowded Nassau County Legislature's public hearing room, honesty, integrity, and respect for community were clearly not the underpinnings of this process. At 1 o'clock in the morning, disappointment was the underlying feeling in those community advocates in attendance who spoke for their communities of interest. One iteration proposed by the majority side of the Nassau County Legislature called for drawing a line around the city of Long Beach and attaching it to Merrick. We aren't contiguous with Merrick at all. Another example of the dysfunction drew a line around a legislator's home block and wrote him out of his own district. Both of those farcical ideas were eventually dropped at a subsequent meeting when public outcry could not be abated. But the cracking and packing of a minority community in Southwest Nassau reflected the selfish, disingenuous, and arrogant abuse of power by elected representatives in the legislature. I am referring to the 5 towns: Hewlett, Woodmere, Cedarhurst, Lawrence, and Inwood. Guidelines in drawing districts called for compact, contiguous communities of interest being kept together. Inwood is geographically connected to the 5 towns. Lawrence and Cedarhurst and Inwood are a community of interest, sharing a school district, bus and railroad routes, and they are aligned with each other. Geographically, Inwood is also a diverse community. The legislature cracked this community of shared interests of family, education, religious affiliations, and transportation, and connected them with Valley Stream, North Valley Stream, and Elmont. This is cracking and packing, unfair. I rejoice that the League of Women Voters stand for the rights of the people to be represented fairly, democratically. My hope is that the lines will be drawn fairly in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. And last but not least, we will have Constance Sterling Engman, member of the League of Women Voters of Tompkins County.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good evening. My name is Connie Sterling Engman, and I'm speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Tompkins County. As a nonpartisan organization, it is extremely important that the League ensures that New York State and our county government identifies and listens to all communities of interest, and not just the political parties as our state undertakes redistricting. Tompkins County is very diverse and includes urban, suburban, and rural communities, with a geographic heart at the southern end of Cayuga Lake. The county's communities of interest include agriculture, health, agricultural and cultural tourism, sustainability and the environment, focused around Cayuga Lake, which unifies rather than divides the county. Our higher education institutions reach out to and link all these communities socially and economically. And through Cornell University, we even have a strong connection to New York City. Thus, we have little in common with Jamestown and the Western Southern Tier, which are in our current district, and far more with Cortland County, which is not. At the state Senate level, communities of interest should be able to come together to speak with one voice. But Tompkins County is currently divided between 3 separate districts. At the local level, a community of interest in Tompkins County can be as small as an elementary school community, a group of non-English speaking refugees, and the homeless population, or as large as the academics who live near the colleges and the farmers who live outside of the city. Every community should have a voice that can be heard. All deserve representation or an effective voice when that community is kept together as a whole and not divided amongst wards or seats or districts. Before the redistricting that followed the 2010 census, Tompkins County's congressional district was described as Abraham Lincoln on a broomstick. This was symbolic of the ways in which our state has been gerrymandered when districts are formed. As we learn of the loss of a congressional seat in New York State as a result of the census, it is more important than ever that we ensure no gerrymandering takes place as district lines are redrawn. The way districts are drawn will impact voters for the next 10 years. They should be drawn with the best interest of voters in mind, not, as in the past, when districts were drawn to deliberately thwart the effort to effect change because it benefited politically those drawing them to do so. The process of drawing district maps at all levels of government should be open and transparent and include avenues such as this meeting for meaningful public input. It is the League of Tompkins County's hope that the new independent commission will redistrict so as to allow everyone to have a voice at every level of government, and that when elections are over, those in power will represent all the people in their district and give voice to minority opinions when possible. That is what the League is all about, helping people vote, helping them know the issues, and helping them have as clear as possible a picture of the candidates they can choose from, assessing which candidates will actually represent everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie, and thank you to all of our incredible speakers. You were all equal parts passionate and succinct, and I can't thank you enough for that. Thank you again to our sponsors, APA Voice and Latino Justice Pearled Up, and thank you to everyone who came on here and listened to these amazing presentations. The recording of this webinar will be available on our website, nyredistricting.org, tomorrow afternoon. We will also make the transcripts available as well. And we will have some written testimonies available as well for anyone who submit those to us. Thank you all again for being on. This is just the first part of the conversation on redistricting, and have a great night, everyone.
Mm-hmm.